Kia ora e te whānau. Welcome to our final episode of Raw Politics for the year. It has been a pleasure being with you for this past year. It has been a full-on year. It has been jam-packed and we are almost at the holiday season. We have a very special episode lined up for you today with the full team. I am Newsroom political editor Laura Walters and I am joined by senior political reporter Marc Daalder here in Wellington. We have our national affairs editor Sam Sachdeva joining us from Christchurch, and as always we have Newsroom co-editor Tim Murphy joining us from Auckland. Hello everyone, we have made it. How are you feeling?
I'm terrific, thank you, Laura. As you can see, enjoying the baubles of office, home office in this case. Sadly, I don't have a grand new title such as Minister for Rail, but I'm sure it's a matter of time before the government gets in touch and gives me some sort of new portfolio to work with.
I think that the person you need to be discussing that with is our esteemed editor, Tim. He might be able to bestow on you a new title just in time for Christmas. What do you reckon, Tim?
Sam, I will come back to you on that with a little red envelope. I am apologising for not being dressed festively or even bedecked festively, other than one small little green bauble, which is a bit like the latest bauble that Winston Peters has got next to his name as Minister of Rail.
Is that the sign of the economic times, Tim? That's how far we could stretch.
We are not into wasteful spending, Laura.
Well, I mean, the government is passing legislation to allow us to advertise if we had a paper on Sunday mornings, which we can't currently do. So that should probably get another bubble or two. Sam, I also do think that you'd make a great Minister for AUKUS if that's what you so desired.
Thank you. I feel like that's a bit of a poison chalice, though, so I will leave that one to the Right Honourable Mr. Peters as well. He can handle that with Judith Collins, of course. Wouldn't want to leave her out.
Okay, much to mull over the holiday period, but before we break and start thinking about what titles we're going to be giving ourselves at the start of next year, we are going to use this episode of Raw Politics to take a look back on a very big year for this incoming coalition government. Some of the highs, some of the lows, some of the best performers, the weird and wonderful moments, and then of course we will be casting forward to 2025 and we will be boldly making some predictions of what we should watch out for and potentially some of the flash points and difficult personalities or political ructions that might happen next year. And as always, to wrap up, we will offer you our recommendations of the year. It has been a big year. Of course, we got a new government at the end of 2023 and they have been moving, as we keep saying, at pace throughout 2024 to push through a very ambitious policy agenda, legislative agenda, and to make sure that they bed in a good working relationship across the three coalition parties. Now, to kick off this episode, I thought that we might talk about our picks of the year, our best performers, our favourite politicians maybe, or the people that we think have gone above and beyond, performed really well and maybe had even a disproportionate impact. So Tim, let's start with you.
Well, mine is one who's been disproportionate, and that's David Seymour, as probably the most effective politician in dealing with what he was dealt last election and making the most of it in getting his things underway or through, but also in claiming, as late as the announcement of the, non-announcement at least, of the ferries for the Cook Strait, the big deal that isn't a deal yet and won't be for a while, but as late as that, which had obviously Winston Peters New Zealand First imprimatur all over it because he's the new Minister of Rail. But Seymour was even claiming that as an example of ACT showing this government how to do more with less. So he's, I think, the political performer. That's not my endorsement, but that's my assessment of him.
And we will talk about this later in this episode, but of course he will also become Deputy Prime Minister next year, so he'll be one to watch in 2025. Sam, who's your pick for the year?
Well, I'll move to the other end of the political spectrum from Tim, and my pick is Chloe Swarbrick, the Greens co-leader, although the de facto leader this year, and that's part of the reason why I think she's worthy of mention. she's had to deal without Marama Davidson, who's been away dealing with her breast cancer diagnosis. The Greens also had the tragic death of Fesso Collins earlier this year. And then a little slightly more serious, or no, not more serious, more fraught political scandals, the resignation of Godla's Gutterman, and of course the enduring saga over Darlene Tana and the drive to use the waka jumping, party hopping legislation to remove her from Parliament. So, look, I think the Greens have been no strangers to difficult years, but even by their standards, this would have to be right up there. But I think Chloe has been quite strong throughout, shown formidable strength of character to keep prosecuting the case against the government from the Greens' perspective, and the fact that she managed to convince the membership to vote by consensus to boot Tana out of Parliament, and that the Greens are still holding steady pretty close to their election time result. I think around 11% or so is quite compelling or striking, I suppose, in terms of how she has managed to hold things together through a very tough period.
And Sam, not forgetting Julianne Genter, of course, with her standover tactics in the House and being referred to the Privileges Committee as well. So, there were probably half that caucus at some point. There was some sort of thing to be dealt with. Yeah.
Yeah, huge feat there for Chloe, kind of, like you say, Sam, moving through that all. And just to add to that, also getting so many new MPs in and trying to help support them, familiarise them with Parliament, that environment, and then get some of them really firing in their portfolio areas, being proactive with putting out press releases, getting in the media, things like that. And so far, no major scandals with that cohort that are new and fresh and coming through. So I think that should be acknowledged as well.
Except Darlene Tana.
Except Darlene Tana, yes. All right, Mark, who do you have for us as your pick of the year?
I've got Shane Jones down. I think it's hard to find something that he hasn't got his way on this year. The only thing that I can think of is that he wanted that personal ministerial power on the fast track bill to approve projects. That's gone, but everything else, he's got his extra consents for marine farms, he's got coal running through the wazoo. He's got, repealing the oil and gas ban has been delayed a couple months due to a technical drafting error, but, there's no doubt that it is coming. And the fast track bill, I think, looks a lot more like what you might expect from a Shane Jones type than a Chris Bishop type, even with the changes that it's gone through. And I suspect that over summer he'll be spending some time in the Coromandel searching out the last of those frogs and squishing them.
And on Shane Jones, that point that you make about the one thing he maybe didn't get his way on, I think his comments have been that, you almost, shoot for the moon and land among the stars. In a campaign, you go as bold as you can and understand that, a good situation for him might be slightly coming back from that. So I don't think he's disappointed with where they've ended up on that either. No. My pick for the year will probably not surprise anyone. I think we have discussed this National Party MP before. It is Erica Stanford. Of course, she has some very heavy portfolios in the education round. Also immigration, which she's been, maybe less of a standout or less high profile on, but education definitely, there has been some big overhauls happening there. She's also managed to kind of walk the line politically, even as recently as this new relationships and sexual education curriculum announcement that she has just made. She was able to say, tick, we've fulfilled the coalition promise with New Zealand First, gotten rid of those guidelines, but actually what's going to replace those guidelines is a new curriculum. And, there has been no promises there that it won't include things around gender diversity and some of those things that, New Zealand First had an issue with. So just one example of how she's managed to kind of walk that fine political line on some of those difficult areas. Of course, massive curriculum overhaul, the bedding in of structured literacy, which she has been a fan of for a really long time. And now she's kind of working on her next pieces are going to be around learning support, closing the equity gap, and raising the value of the teaching profession. And those all sound like very difficult things to achieve, but she's obviously a very hard worker and very committed. Also, the other what would you say, responsibility that she has, of course, is for the government's response to the Royal Commission into abuse and care. And as we've noted on this podcast many times, she has been a very sound advocate on behalf of survivors. She has pushed very hard for their viewpoints to be heard and acknowledged, and for there to be not only kind of meaningful political responses, but also action on that. And we understand that, again, that's quite a politically fraught area. There are different degrees of interest in how far they go with things like redress and, changing or overhauling the whole care system. But she seems to still be pushing forward as hard as she can in that space, and it has not gone unnoticed by the community. So, yeah, I think Erica Stanford has been a bit of a standout this year. So those are our top picks for politicians for the year. But now let's have a chat about some of the biggest political moments of 2024. There have been many. It is obviously hard to pick standouts, but we are going to try. And Mark, I am going to throw to you first.
I think mine was a little overlooked at the time, but it will have ramifications for many future generations, and that is David Seymour's excision of woke foods from the school cafeterias. A whole generation of wokeness will come to an end in the schools. No, seriously, mine is the budget, which I think actually landed a bit flat, a little bit anticlimactic at the time, particularly with that tax relief being, 2 months away. Then the tax relief landed, and again, it's small enough that it's not something that, suddenly people are going out and partying with it, but it was unquestionably the focus of the first half of the year. Will that tax relief land? What will it look like? Will National fulfill their promise? And they did. And I think that probably has earned them some brownie points with the electorate, or at least avoided the loss of some brownie points. And that will be, an important part of how people evaluate the government's economic claims and promises going into the next election as well.
And there's also the flip side of that, isn't it? The massive cost-saving exercise that was begun under this government, and of course will continue out into future budgets as well. Totally. Very difficult decisions and balancing act there. What is your political moment of the year, Sam?
Yeah, look, sometimes the obvious answer is the best one. So for me, it was the hikoi to Parliament protesting against the Treaty Principles Bill. Upwards of 40,000 people outside on Parliament's lawn making their voices heard. I was actually out of the country when it was happening. I was away at the APEC summit or travelling after it. But just seeing the international headlines, the coverage it got everywhere, and just that show of that show of opposition, that show of concern. I think you've got very veteran reporters that have said they've never seen anything like that. So it's pretty staggering, and we haven't seen the last of it. We've got the select committee process that's going to run. David Seymour seems to want to milk it for as long as he can. So I guess what the ramifications are in terms of an organised political movement among Māori and Pākehā remains to be seen.
How about you, Tim?
I think it was a moment of raw politics for me, and that was where power met victims, and that was the Crown Apology. The events around the Crown Apology, not just Luxon's words in Parliament, but where people of authority, power and influence had to face up to these people who had suffered over generations, both in care and in their fights for justice in the courts. And that demonstration, that direct and raw demonstration of people's ability to say their piece or attempt to be heard in front of those who perhaps had power over them was something else. And that should, if the apology holds and redress is made, it should mark a real milestone in New Zealand history.
Yeah, Tim, both your moment and Sam's, of course, will have ongoing kind of ramifications and impacts as we go forward, so it'll be really important to keep an eye on those. Mine is... like I said, that there are so many and it's hard to pick one, but I'm really interested in a moment that happened earlier this year when Mark actually broke the story about Christopher Luxon claiming the $52,000 accommodation allowance to live in his own apartment that he owns without a mortgage, or owned at the time without a mortgage. And while it might seem kind of a bit light and silly, the comment of being, I'm entitled to the entitlements, and what came out of that, I think is a really interesting one to follow politically. And throughout the year, we have seen different polls where the New Zealand public has been asked whether or not the Prime Minister is, in touch with the people of New Zealand, whether he can really understand the struggles of people in this economic environment, when he, then went on to say, I'm wealthy, I'm sorted. So I think that, that moment earlier in the year where he didn't have the political nous, firstly, to understand that claiming the allowance was an issue, and then everything that kind of flowed from that, the way he handled it, his quotes around it, and his feeling of entitlement and how he voiced that, I think was incredibly telling about him as a politician and him as a person, and it's something that we've kind of watched in different ways play out throughout the year. I feel like these are all quite serious and quite heavy moments from the year, as they should be. But there have also, of course, been some quite weird and wonderful moments throughout the year. And in honour of these, Newsroom has put together some annual awards, as has become tradition. And while we're not going to run through all of them today, we do have a little bit of a teaser. Marc, of course, has helped with these, and he set up the Premier House Prize, which comes with that $52,000 reward, and that goes to the Prime Minister, Christopher Luxon, of course. And could you give us a couple of others that are going to be on that list, Marc, as well?
Absolutely. Well, there's, of course, the Open Door Policy Award for the most accessible politician. Casey Costello wins that one for the door being so wide open that you could just drop off whatever documents you want on her desk and she'll forward them to the ministry for you. But an honourable mention goes to Shane Jones, not the door in his Beehive office so much as the door to various seafood restaurants throughout the country where any industry representatives might like to take him. And hey, you don't even need to put it in the diary necessarily.
We also have the Biggest Loser award that unsurprisingly has to go to Nationals' Andrew Bailey after that very bizarre and surprising interaction or exchange at a winery a little bit earlier in the year. For the full list of award recipients, you can check out that story on newsroom.co.nz.
Can those of us who didn't participate just chip in one or two?
Yes, please do.
I have a political cringe of the year, and it was a tie. And the tie is between Christopher Luxon on TikTok being filmed having a bucket of water thrown over him so that he could announce that somehow that related to New Zealanders having the benefit of tax cuts. So it was kind of a wet T-shirt sort of a moment for the Prime Minister. That was one. And the other cringe was Carmel Sepuloni sloping off from her time and her duties as deputy to a party that's really been on its knees at that stage of the year to appear on whatever it was, Celebrity Treasure Island or Survivor or some game show. Really, come on.
Yeah, I'm so pleased that I did not see that Luxon wet T-shirt moment that you're referring to, Tim. There are some moments I'm happy to not be on TikTok.
Do we want to put it on the screen? A bit of a content warning first, but then, it's an option.
No, let's not, please. People need to enjoy their Christmas. Let's not do that to them.
Tax relief is here, and that means for the average income household, you'll get up to $102 a fortnight in tax relief.
Right, that's 2024. Now, what about 2025? It is coming down the barrel at us very quickly. We, as mentioned, are going to try and put some predictions in place for next year. And if you don't mind, I might kick it off. Now, I don't think that any of these are surprising to people, and more predictions in policy areas, and some that we have already discussed in the past. But I think one to watch early in the year is going to be Māori Crown relations. there has been already a deterioration in that space, and we would expect that to happen further. There could be more invites rescinded or more uninvites issued from different iwi and different Māori Crown engagements that have been long running. Just to build on that a little bit, in January next year, I think the 10th of January, there will be a national hui held or hosted by Ngāti Kahungunu. Then we're straight into Rātana, and then after that, Waitangi, and all the while we'll have the Treaty Principles Select Committee process running. Of course, that won't be the end of it, because then there is the review of 28 pieces of legislation and their treaty clauses or treaty obligations in those laws. And then after that, the government will be turning their attention to the Waitangi Tribunal and the rescoping of that. So no end in sight in terms of those tensions. That's going to be a space to watch incredibly closely next year. And my other area to watch, if you will, is kind of generally around the youth and the care space. Of course, we've had a lot of focus this year on boot camps. Seems like things are not going too well in that area, but I expect, especially after the new legislation comes in, that will continue to be a thorn in the side of this government around youth offending, around oranga tamariki and the care and services it delivers, and potentially the relationship between the Children's Minister and that ministry. Of course, then we also have the recommendations of the Royal Commission running alongside that are recommending some overhauls and big systemic changes of the care system. So all of those things, I think, it could be a bit of a perfect storm in that space around youth and children. On the flip side of that, the government will be also looking to bed in its social investment agency that looks to kind of help or lift up these families and these children early on, to place early intervention in there. We haven't seen much in that space yet, but 2025 might be the time that we start to see that take shape. All right, Sam, what do you think? What's coming in 2025?
Yeah, I will apologise first because I don't think these are Nostradamus level insights or prophecies, but the first one is that, we will hear positive words, positive signs from the government around a free trade agreement with India, but it will become even clearer that there's not going to be a deal worth signing before the end of this parliamentary term. Christopher Luxon will be heading over there sometime early next year, so I suspect there might be some sort of announcement, maybe that negotiations have started. Winston Peters hinted at that last week, but I think realistically, from everything we've seen and heard from the Indian government, the High Commissioner, they are not going to rush it. There are still a lot of sensitive areas, so I think it's one of those pledges that Prime Minister Luxon will have to give up on. Whether that's officially done next year or not, I don't know, but that's going to be a crunch point, I think, at which becomes clear that there's not enough time left to get something done and across the line. Similarly, perhaps stating the obvious, but I think Donald Trump will end up causing chaos, and that'll affect New Zealand foreign policy. We've seen like Christopher Luxon and Winston Peters talk about getting closer to like-minded partners working with the US, but that was not really taking into account, I think, the Trump factor. So we saw that in the first year of his first term, where there was the ban on Muslim countries, quote unquote, and New Zealand officials scrambling to deal with that. So we might be a little bit more prepared this time, but there's only so much you can prepare for when it comes to Mr. Trump. So I think that's going to really shape a lot of the foreign policy discourse in 2025 for New Zealand.
Yeah, lots to watch out for there in the foreign policy space. Mark, what have you got for us? I assume we're going to talk climate?
We are. I expect to see more of not a lot on climate. We saw this week, as a follow-up to last week's episode, the release of the emissions reduction plan, which, for example, has one policy on transport, which is to see more EV chargers be built and maybe be involved in that, which will reduce transport emissions by 0.016%. So more of that kind of approach to climate policy. You've stolen one of mine, which was talking about the reform of the Waitangi Tribunal.
Sorry, I should have read the notes.
That's all good. I think that'll be, a bigger focus next year, particularly given how much the tribunal has been a thorn in the side for the government, which makes this reform look even more political than it might have, say, a year ago. I think this will be a make or break year for the health system as well. It's the point where we see whether all of Lester Levy's hard work and or book cooking, is successful in righting the ship, not just financially, because, the books are one thing, but actually are people going to be getting better care, or are they going to be waiting less time? Is the quality of that care going to be better? By the end of next year, the government will have been in office for 2 years. They made really big, bold promises about what things would look like under them. It's the big question for Shane Ratty at the end of the year will be, are things better than they were 2 years ago? The fast track bill, will pass this year, but we'll actually start to see those projects filtering through the pipeline next year, and I'd expect quite a lot of controversy on quite a lot of them. Some of that will be NIMBY stuff in relation to housing developments, but you'll also see the environmental activists come out. You'll see iwi Māori come out, particularly for projects that are on their rohe or near it, and resisting things in maybe a way we haven't seen in a couple of generations. This is maybe a little bit out of my wheelhouse, but I'm gonna throw it out there. I don't think a big surge in house prices next year, even though those interest rates will keep coming down. The economic predictions are tough to read, and so I don't think anyone's putting a vast amount of money on, returning to that kind of COVID era, really low interest rate environment that really spiked house prices.
Can I just put you on the spot here, Mark?
Absolutely.
You talked about make or break year for the health system. Can Reti hold on to his job? Do we expect him to remain as health minister throughout next year, or what's that, going to hang on?
I think for Shane Ratty to lose his job would require something bigger than just underperformance, right? Underperformance, people being generally dissatisfied, that's not uncommon for any health minister, to be honest. It's a hospital pass, pun unintended, for any minister. So I think he'd need to mess up in a really big way. But looking at, for example, the Dunedin hospital decisions, that has sparked a significant amount of outrage. A couple more things on maybe that scale, and maybe he starts to worry about his seat.
All right, Tim, what do you have for us in your predictions for 2025?
I'm predicting on both politics and policy. Starting with the politics, I'm going to predict that come the end of the tenure of the Deputy Prime Minister, that in fact he refuses to leave, starts a movement called Stop the Steal, and urges his followers to rally against this outrageous change to act. No, he'll be gone, and we'll have a new DPM in Seymour. On policy, yes, the budget will be pivotal again, because it's going to have to cut again. To do what they set out to do, to cut what they described as wasteful spending, they've only gone part way. They haven't got the deficit under control or the debt trajectories. They need to do a lot more, and they've given themselves so little to spend next financial year, the next one and the next one, that there's going to be some severe work done cutting back public spending. And back on politics, I'm going to predict that the current Speaker, Jerry Brownlee, will be moved on, both for two reasons. One is that his performance, I think, is still wobbly, and the House isn't very cohesive. As late as this week, there were sort of arguments and organisational issues over the fast track bill that I would have thought a Leader of the House and a Speaker and others could have sort of got through ahead of it becoming an issue. But many other things, including the way the House behaves and the way Winston Peters and Shane Jones get away with all sorts of things, and how Labour jeer and carry on. I think for that reason, but also I think there will come a time when the plum job of Ambassador, or High Commissioner, Ambassador at least, to Dublin, to Ireland, comes up to replace Trevor, and so one Speaker could replace the other. My next prediction, very rapidly, is that Chris Hipkins won't be leader at the end of next year if Labour is intent on winning in 2026. If they're prepared to do a good fight and hold in opposition, then he might. And my last one is that a whole bevy, I count 6 of the 34 Labour MPs, will be encouraged to move along and make way for new talent, which you can only do when you're languishing in opposition. And those people are Adrian Rurafe, Greg O'Connor, Jenny Salesa, Phil Twyford, Damien O'Connor, and David Parker. no surprises in that in the longer serving people, but that should come to pass as well.
And when Chippy goes, do you think that Carmel Sepuloni loses her kind of leadership role as well there, and that leader and co-leader are replaced?
No, she joins WBD Discovery as a host for some talent show.
I agree, Tim, with your Jerry prediction. I think the House is extremely fractious, right? Just not just in terms of like the pomp and the show of it, but like the vibes are often very bad, right? Like we had this whole Karen Chor issue around the bullying. We have people making racially tinged comments, nationally, xenophobic comments around various other MPs, and Jerry seemingly just not being quick enough to actually get to it when it's an issue, and then coming back to it a week later, bringing it all up again. He's not doing the job of stewarding the House that you expect the Speaker to do. He's now finally got everyone's names down, but not the pronunciations yet. There's got to be someone better, right? Somewhere within the three coalition parties.
I don't think
or
he has.
Even the opposition.
I don't think he has finally got the names right, Mark. He was misnamed the ACT MP Laura Trask, who must have either just got married or not married, one or the other, but has changed her name and had to correct him just this week.
Yeah, I mean, he should know as the Speaker of the House, but that is a new change, Laura McClure. Just on personality, since we're giving these predictions, does anyone else have them? I mean, Tim, you brought up the change in Deputy PM. Should we expect that to be smooth sailing, or could there be some ructions around that, do we think?
It'll be pretty smooth, but Peters will have a whole lot more time on his hands, or so he thinks. Perhaps with the rail portfolio, he won't have quite so much, so he'll be freer to do what he thinks he needs to do in that 18 months as well. So there'll be more action, perhaps, that end of things.
What do you think, Sam, in terms of personality predictions for next year? Is there anyone that you think has been kind of skating on thin ice and might be showing the door, or people that are due to hit their stride?
Well, in terms of thin ice, I think that the top candidate's probably Casey Costello, although the coalition dynamics make that difficult, but she's been under pressure the whole year and hasn't really managed to come out from that. So at some point you might wonder if even Winston Peters thinks, do we need to make a change there and swap in another of our MPs? And then Andrew Bailey is another one who is obviously had some sort of concerning behaviour this year. Maybe not so serious, but again, if you're going to look to make change and bring in fresh blood in cabinet, that might be one way to do it. In terms of high performers to look out for, James Meagher, I think. There's been a lot of chat about him. That wouldn't be a secret to most political observers, but he is chairing the select committee that'll be considering the Treaty Principles Bill next year, so that'll be further publicity time in the spotlight for him. And I think there are a lot of people who expect him to rise up the ranks. So, I'll be keeping an eye on his trajectory, I guess, and where he heads next.
And I always wonder about this with up-and-coming politicians. Of course, they're noticed by, the likes of us and political commentators and things because they have talent and because they're showing something different, some kind of flair or political nous or, eye for policy detail. But then I also feel like they become self-fulfilling prophecies. The more we talk up people, the more likely they are sometimes to end up in those positions where they are given more power and more responsibility as well. So just an observation there, with Christopher Luxon, for example, before he was even in the job, people were talking about him becoming PM, and here we are.
I think that can happen, but sometimes people do hit their ceilings. Kitty Allen, putting aside the issues with her particular ministerial resignation, but even before that, she had been talked about as in a similar way, potentially future leader of the Labour Party, and then by the time she got her ministerial portfolios, there was a sense that actually maybe this was as far as she was going to go, at least internally. Ardern Williams is another person who people were really high on in 2020 when she was first elected, and then it seemed like she's dropped off a bit. But if you actually watch her these days in the House and select committees, she's very much across her brief. She's got the policy down and the politics. Yes, she made this kind of awkward statement a year or so ago around the winter energy payment and her father needing it, but I think she's someone who maybe couldn't quite immediately live up to the expectations that were had of her, but very quickly has upskilled, and maybe that's gone a little bit unnoticed because people have readjusted their expectations downwards.
And I don't think it's a bad thing. In the case of Arena Williams, she's doing a lot of that learning and upskilling out of the technically in the public eye, but it's 8, 9, 10 o'clock at night when she's on house duty and taking calls to debate on very technical pieces of legislation, and she knows her stuff inside out. So using those kind of opportunities to upskill and get that experience is probably a good way to do it.
I also agree Bailey seems to me the most likely contender to lose his job. It should be, I think, as we've discussed before, Casey Costello, but she does seem to be bulletproof, and it's hard to imagine what might actually change for her to lose that role. But Bailey, showed an error of judgment in the loser comment, and anecdotally seems to continue to be engaging in similar kinds of errors of judgment. And so, doesn't seem to have learned his lesson from that, and if something does come out in the public, it probably would be the end for him, right? Luxon's made that pretty clear.
Can I give you an example of the reverse of all of this? Is someone who the media and the commentary had marked down substantially. There were no expectations on this person's performance, but Sam Uffindell, the National MP for Tauranga, seems to have quite a favoured run, or at least they looked favourably on him within National. So he had his little scandal, I think, before even being elected, or just after, of having,
it was a pretty sizable scandal, Tim, I think.
Well, it was, but it was a historic, wasn't it? It was a boarding school bullying with a chair leg or whatever it was. But he has recovered from that in their eyes, and is often prominent. Asking questions of ministers in the House. Yes, the patsy questions, but they give him the role. And chairing a select committee, and he stands out there during scrutiny week and other times. He could be a surprise who, in spite of all the non-talk and no favouritism from those who pick these things, might end up getting somewhere in this life.
But you wonder whether that's National's pick and whether that resonates with how the public will receive him if they do keep putting him forward like this. I think when you've got something like that from your start as a backbench MP and you botch it the way he did, and then he had these comments, was that earlier this year, about all the favours he does for his wife by shopping once a month? I just think, yes, people within the party might rate him highly, but National, unlike maybe a small party like New Zealand First, is accountable to the public and the public mood in a way that caps where he could go unless he really truly excels in some extraordinary way.
Mark, I'm not picking him for National Party leader.
Deputy leader, though, right? That's what you're saying.
Just lastly, before we wrap up these predictions around personalities and politics, Sam, you were talking about Chloe Swarbrick earlier. I'm interested as well in what you think the Green Party looks like going into next year. I mean, do we expect to see a different leadership? Is it too early to know what that looks like and whether Marama Davidson returns? What does it look like with, potentially a reshuffle at the top? I'm not sure. What do we think about that?
Yeah, I think it's potentially a little bit premature to make any predictions or calls about the leadership. I think a lot will depend on Marama Davidson and how she's feeling. I haven't seen any updates really that suggest she's ready to come back to work yet, and I think but she has to make a call either way, really. I don't think she's going to be forced out at all. So, but look, there have been some strong early performers. I think Francisco Hernandez has been prosecuting the government's public service cuts quite well. He's stood out to me. So there are some first-term MPs there who are talented and maybe could could pick up more work, but it's going to be interesting, isn't it, to see how they shape themselves as they start to look towards the next election.
The one other person I want to put out there, not a Green Party MP, but Hannah Rafferty Maipi Clark, just seeing, with the eyes of even the world on her at this stage, what does that look like next year? I don't have a prediction of how it will go, but I think there will be a big spotlight on her and on much of what she does, and how she handles that might determine, what her political future looks like.
Let's wrap things up with some recommendations, something you have watched, read or listened to this year that you've enjoyed. Tim, let's go to you first.
Mine is a standout series by Aaron Smale for Newsroom on the cover-up, basically. The Royal Commission called it a cover-up into the state abuse and state care. It's not party political, this series. It's involving lots of politicians and political leaders over generations and a lot of the leaders of our government. But it's well worth maybe a summer read. It's very long, substantial, but worth it.
Thank you. And Sam, what have you got for us?
Yeah, I have similarly a series, or perhaps not a formal series, but it's taken the form of it. Guy Nespin is reporting for RNZ on Casey Costello, her decisions around tobacco policy and the questionable information that has informed that. It's sort of been a testament to the doggedness of a reporter. He's kind of been pursuing this relentlessly, and I think the sort of cumulative impact it had has been quite significant. As I said earlier, she's really struggled to get out from underneath the sort of negative coverage around that, and that's, I think, quite reasonable concerns that have been raised about the information she and her office have used to make tobacco policy. So yeah, I think that's one of the standout pieces of coverage this year for me.
Mark?
Yeah, mine's not an agenda setter like the others, but I went through all of my recommendations over the past year trying to figure out which one I wanted to throw up there again, and it's Joel McManus's piece for the spin-off, Dispatch from the Budget Debate back in May. I laughed when I read it the first time, and I laughed again this morning, which made me decide that this is the one I wanted to recommend.
Sometimes those are the best pieces, aren't they? The ones where you can just sit back and have a laugh and it's not all despair. I'm going to recommend Mark's fantastic scoop that I referenced earlier about the PM claiming that $52,000 a year accommodation allowance. It has been a gift that kept on giving throughout the year and continues to be referenced in the context of whether or not the Prime Minister is in touch with struggling everyday Kiwis. If you haven't read it already, go back and do that. That is it from Raw Politics for 2024. Thank you to our producer, Dave Filoi-Ali'i, and all of our readers, listeners and viewers. We have appreciated the time that you've given us, and we do plan to be back next year. If you have any burning questions, thoughts, hot takes, send them our way. My email is laura.walters@newsroom.co.nz. You'll find us here next year on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. In the meantime, have a fantastic break over the summer and happy holidays from the team here at Raw Politics.